where my mind was at with the revisionism dispute that we were talking about, and the language of how, for Luxemburg versus Bernstein, the very conception of the future goal and strategy necessarily changes the character of one's actions in the present. Whereas Bernstein is saying, well, the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. And Luxemburg says, well, without the goal, the movement is merely tantamount to, liberal, democratic organizing at best.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
All right, welcome to the Diet Soap Podcast. With me today is Will Stratford. Will is a PhD candidate in modern European history at Boston College. He's also the author of a controversial Sublation magazine article, which I retitled The Circular Logic of Bhaskar Sankara. What was your original title for that, Will?
Oh, it was why Bhaskar... No, I think it was just Bhaskar Sankara is blocking socialism, or why? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. Well,
although it's not even, you can't even find it online anymore, which is, I think, why the provenance of our current conversation is someone had told me that, and I messaged you and said, hey, what happened to the article? And then you're like, hey, you should get on the show. And, a year later, we're here.
Yeah, here we are. Well, you know what? The original website for the magazine is back online. So we had tried to transfer a bunch of our content from the original website onto our new WordPress website, which is sort of still a mess. But we decided to, rather than try to fix that WordPress website, which we were struggling with, we would just relaunch the original one. So people can go to sublationmag.com and look for your name.
So you can find it.
Yes, The Circular Logic of Bhaskar Sankara is back online. We are just about to relaunch Sublation magazine. I will be the editor-in-chief. Well, now you know everything that the viewers don't, because I've cut a bit, but now you know everything. There's a secret that people will have to, and maybe they can go find out in the parent room. Probably not.
The circular logic of Dublin's publication history.
Yeah. But okay. But I want to ask you a question that's kind of tangential to this circular logic of Bhaskar Sankara, but it's not maybe entirely, which is that you're writing now about the revisionism dispute. And you sent me chapter 2 from a thesis on that includes anyway the revisionism dispute.
Right.
And I wonder, to what degree do you think the politics of someone like Bhaskar Sankara are revisionist, or are some way coming out of the Bernstein side of the revisionism dispute, or am I doing a disservice to Bernstein to make that or to ask that question?
Yeah, no. There's a lot to unpack there, and insofar as I have a simple answer, you basically led with it, which is indeed Bhaskar Sankara, Jacquemin DSA, falls below the threshold of Bernstein, both at the level of ideas, I would say, ideology, and maybe more fundamentally organizationally, politically, right? In terms of the conditions for Bernstein's ideas, namely a mass socialist party. So that's perhaps the more important condition there, the social condition, the organizational, political condition. But perhaps if we're talking about the level of ideas, it's both and in the sense that where there's a kind of digression and a kind of falling below Bernstein's insights is really the kind of singularly political vision, or perhaps you can say very circumscribed pseudo-political vision of Sankara and others that has to do with, basically participating in the capitalist party and the Democrats to create the conditions for kind of genuine social organizing in civil society, genuine working class socialist politics and political organizing. So that's, in other words, that reliance on non-socialist politics, that is completely alien to someone like Bernstein in really the entire workers' movement of that era in the turn of the 20th century, that you would have to rely on, the vicissitudes of capitalist politics to dictate your strategy and vision. So that's where it clearly falls below. And just generally, we can say, social action, in other words, any kind of organizing outside of mere election cycles, that social action was the heart of the workers' movement, but especially the Socialist Party. Despite that, when we think party, we think of like, oh, parliament, elections, what the party activity, as people understood it and enacted it back then, was mostly civil social activity. And so in that sense, it falls below, right? Insofar as that's not really part of the discussion. But then, I would also qualify it to say that, sure, there at the level of ideas, there are clear affinities, consciously and otherwise, in the kind of Fabianism, the progressivism that constitutes aspects of Bernstein. And so one of the more interesting aspects is how contemporaneously for Bernstein, the meaning of revisionism, it comes to be a kind of gravitational node of what are actually distinct tendencies within and around the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which can be described as just mere reformism, but also kind of like pragmatism. They're called like Die Praktiker, the sort of representatives of the SPD that were really just anti-theoretical per se. And so what happens is a lot of these basically Marxist skeptical or anti-Marxist elements within the movement, they kind of recognize themselves in Bernstein. I think there's a quotation by Joseph Bloch of one of the main kind of reformist magazines of like, oh, we finally saw who we were in Bernstein. So he does sort of, the revisionism takes on, becomes like talismanic for these various kind of anti-Marxist tendencies, just as a historical point.
Right. So just to clarify what the revisionism dispute was about, and I'm going to give you my hackneyed, vulgar version after having read your chapter, but also from some ideas I got before. It came down to the thought that there was not it was not necessary for a political revolution to occur in order for socialism to be arrived at, and that there were also alongside that the strategy for revolution that came out of Marxism was misguided for a variety of reasons. One was that the proletariat wasn't being concentrated together to the degree that Marx believed that they would be. They were there were more small shops and other forms of work other than factory work that were still taking hold in the developed world. Also, though, there was a theoretical difficulty that the whole foundation of the kind of dialectical approach to socialism that Marx had laid out, including his analysis of political economy, was wrong. That perhaps we didn't have to overcome some the labor theory of value. We didn't have to overcome labor itself. We didn't have to change qualitatively in order to create socialism. That the necessity for a political project to transform the mode of production wasn't required. That capitalist society on a class basis was evolving towards a more democratic, egalitarian, socialist form.
Right. And that's where, I mean, so first I would say Yeah, like that's a good, fine summary. But maybe the first thing I'd say is those are all related aspects. So it's even the seemingly empirical, as you sort of said, like, there's claims about the descriptive aspects, Bernstein's account of contemporary capitalism, and then there's theoretical claims. Those actually are inseparable. And at some level, it does hinge on what you alluded to, which is Bernstein's explicit rejection of dialectics. And it's quite fascinating, and that's how it fits into my broader dissertation, of which this forms chapter 2. Basically moves chronologically from the beginning of the SPD in 1890 to World War One, so 1890 to 1914, 5 chapters. And so the first chapters, like those first 8 years, kind of laying out the Erfurt program of 1891 and the basic fundamental ideas and programmatic strategy. And then the second chapter is sort of from 1898, the beginning of the revisionism dispute, goes up to 1905, where there's the 1905 Russian Revolution that erupts. And so the revisionism dispute, it is a singular moment of theoretical, but also strategic crisis of really the self-understanding of the movement. And so that's all to say that all these elements that you've laid out are deeply interrelated. And perhaps the one you said first of, that Bernstein is questioning the necessity of political revolution. I think that really gets at the heart of it. And then we can sort of talk about the ideas around it. But again, I would say most profoundly, it's related to his rejection of dialectics per se, the Hegelian dialectical core of SPD Marxism.
Okay, so can you explain to me how it is that the necessity of political revolution and the creation of a dictatorship of the proletariat is arrived at dialectically, and how you could, if you rejected dialectics, no longer see those strategies as required or necessary?
Right. Yeah. So there are many elements of this. We could talk about methodologically, going back to this question of kind of empiricism, description, because a lot of Bernstein's modus operandi is he's questioning Marx's description of capitalism, where it's at, but also its trajectory, where it's going. And so, as you mentioned, he's saying that, oh, well, here in the 1890s, we're in something of a boom. So it really comes down to the kind of crisis conception of capitalism. In other words, the dialectics here as the very understanding of what capitalism is. And according to the Marxist dialectical concept, capitalism can't be understood simply as a positive thing, but as a self-contradiction and as a moving self-contradiction of the totality that is sort of begging to be resolved dialectically, as in overcoming its own imminent conditions. And so with that conception of capitalism, the core of that is understanding that crisis constitutes capitalism. So it's that aspect that Bernstein is rejecting. And it goes hand in hand with the rejection of revolution, because, it's not like Marxists are just like, we want some upheaval, we want political revolution. It's, we're salivating for it, but rather that it's sort of the necessary endpoint for the building class contradiction that's imminently growing. And so that's again just sort of highlighting the interconnectedness between these things. But fundamentally, one of the things that I try to draw attention to in this chapter, and I'm like in chapter 4 and 5 now, so I'm kind of, my head is in like 1905 onward. I wrote this a few semesters ago, but in this period of the pre-1905 years of the SPD, one of the things that the revisionism dispute generates is a more profound sort of turning the critique of capitalism within onto the party, onto the movement itself, and really growing in their sense that the party, the socialist movement, is not immune to the self-contradictions of capitalism. Not only that, but it in fact embodies them. And so that, yeah.
I want to slow down for a second and
Sure.
take this in two parts, because the first part is difficult enough, right? I mean, I basically agree with you, but I don't want to agree with you dogmatically. I want to fully understand it, right? So capitalism should be understood as a crisis, not as an object in the world, or not as some sort of social organization which is stable but for some irregularities or contingent problems, but rather there's something about the capitalist form of society that means both on the level of economic production and also politically, legally, socially, culturally, that leads it into perpetual moments of crisis, right?
Yeah, and agree or disagree, it's a question of what's the Marxist account, because there are different anti-capitalism.
No, I agree, but I want to know why I agree a little bit, and this is an opportunity for me to refresh, right?
Yeah.
So what is it about capitalist society that drives it into crisis? One way to think of it would be that it's the class basis of the society, because on the one hand, ideologically, it is a society based on freedom for every individual, the freedom to work and participate in society as they wish, right? And based on their own desire. But on the other hand, it seems that by being a person whose primary form of freedom is the freedom to work, you end up kind of enslaved to a capitalist master, or you enslaved to a capitalist entity, whether it's a corporation or a state or a private owner, and you, through your freedom, become less free. That's one way to, or become unfree. Is that one of the central contradictions? Is that the central contradiction of capitalist society that drives it into crisis?
I mean, you're sort of explicating an aspect of the exploitative nature of capitalist contradiction at the economic level, and I think that's it's a prominent manifestation. But I think the more fundamental contradiction, is articulated in that basic formulation of the crisis of social relations of labor and industrial forces of production, as Marx kind of lays out in 1848 in the Communist Manifesto. And so that's partly to say that, I think for Marx and for Marxism, class and the class conflict, bourgeois proletarian class conflict, is a high social political expression of that basic condition of social relations and modes of production. But I mean, we can get into that more, but I think for the revisionism dispute, they're talking at a particular moment when the crises of capitalism is not in question at all. Like it's not really a question. It's not really a debate about like whether or not these conditions of capitalism are there. It's really a question about how and if they're being resolved and by whom. Just to sort of turn to the revision debate, because they're not completely they're not having like a merely abstract conversation or a merely economic conversation.
Okay, well, no, but I want to just we're going to start with this abstraction and we can get to the more
sure.
But so the contradiction between the social relations amongst the workers and the industrial form that that it takes, right? So like the social relations and production, and what was the other one again? The
Industrial
material
forces of
forces,
production.
the industrial forces, the material forces, the way in which it's actually done
Not
in practice.
merely, I mean, material, but the general social intellect. So the way that social forces and the workers themselves are consolidated, and they're interfaced together in such a way that they work as a unit, like in the, I guess, archetypically like Taylorism or something, the sort of putting to use scientific forms of labor and of factory line, assembly line, really best captured in the reality and image of the machine, right? So fixed capital versus variable capital would be the Marxist formulation, but maybe more tangibly, dead labor and living labor. Like that's maybe the most tangible way to understand the crisis, is that there's a simultaneous pressure for the investors of capital to invest in, either fixed capital, either invest in building these machines and these techniques of industrial production, or in wages. And obviously they have to pay to keep the workers alive, and they also want to invest in, getting a greater surplus from investment in the forces of production. So it's this crisis of how the investment of surplus value is directed, but more profoundly, that itself is part of what the Marxists recognize as really a crisis of epochs, right? In other words, as you were getting to, the society of freedom that emerged over centuries, bourgeois society, that kind of free society where one's labor, one's productive activity becomes the basis of their individual and social freedom. That society has become the tool, and it's become instrumentalized by this other general will of the realization of capital. And so there's a way in which the crisis itself is really a crisis between the present and the future. In other words, the present society based on labor relations, bourgeois social relations, the crisis of the bourgeois present and the socialist future. So that's like a Hegelian historical way of thinking of the contradiction, is you are living in constipated socialism. And capitalism is the word for that constipation. But in other words, the industrial forces of production have already moved us in some. Are you smirking at the use of the word constipation?
Yeah, I'm thinking about
biological metaphors getting.
Yeah, I was like, all right, so now if I'm one of these, let's say I go to the doctor and the doctor were to tell me, oh, well, the problem is you've got the constipation.
We need a political enema.
I would start by saying, could you explain to me how the bowel works? So, and so that's kind of what I want to do here for a moment and say, okay, I get you. I understand the big picture, but what I'm still wondering about is, okay, what are the social relations of production other than variable capital? In other words, other than how it's described through where the surplus is directed, right? What is the social relations? Because when you hear social relations, you might think the way that the workers talk to each other, gather together outside of work, to organize themselves on the job, trade with one another. These are the social relations of
no, much more fundamentally,
okay,
bourgeois right. So just the more fundamental point that for hundreds of years we've constituted our social basis on the exchange of labor, and what we valorize,
okay,
subconsciously, right? Not sort of what our society deems and operates as valuable is human productive activity. So it doesn't have to be some metaphysical 20th century question of like, is the labor theory of value true or not? As various anti-communists want to sort of debate it as a logic, but just a way of articulating, well, what is the basis of society? What is the metabolism of society? And really the earlier bourgeois thinkers like Smith, on the sort of culmination of this long social revolution out of feudalism, when there was very different social relations, that's when there's the articulation of these things, for the first time, that's really laying out that, like, not only are we living in a society based on labor, but we should be sure to recognize and pursue as such, as against various other relations based on land ownership or mineral resources or plantation rights. So various other, or just basic manorial hierarchy, and religious hierarchy, et cetera, et cetera.
So one way to think about it is that the difficulty is between the independence of the workers as individuals with bourgeois right, with the right to work, the right to own their own labor power and sell it on the market, right? And the interdependence that arises in the totality of society and leads to the ossification and materialization of certain techniques of production, which become constant capital.
I mean, that's raising the complex question of, like, primitive accumulation and whether or not we can simply narrate the development of the.
How does it raise primitive accumulation? I'm just
well, be just insofar as that's the catchword for, like, okay, what's the provenance of the development of capitalism in contrast to just bourgeois society per se? Like, when does capital really develop? And in that sense, it's raising that profound question of, well, did bourgeois social relations, like, necessarily contain the seeds of industrial forces of production, of capitalism per se? And that's a question that's kind of impossible to adjudicate historically exactly. We're sort of overdetermined in the way we would make such a determination, but I think the formulation of industrial forces of production, it at least helps date and emphasize that there's a specific moment starting in England in the late 18th century, but especially in the 19th century, in Europe, that there's a clear kind of relation between industrialization and the exacerbation of this crisis. So that's
right.
to say that's putting a little pressure, against the idea that, the bourgeois social relations, labor exchange per se, necessarily leads to and contains the seeds of,
okay, but I'm not a historian, so I'm a fiction writer primarily, so I can imagine, right, arriving at industrial forms of production through cooperative activity amongst workers who.
Well, that's what happened. That's what
right.
happened. I mean, that's the whole basis. Bourgeois social relations is another way of saying cooperation, right? It's the whole radical liberal concept of a society based on cooperation rather than based on war and conquest and slavery, which was the human condition hitherto, more or less.
So you cooperate together on forms of manufacture or industrial production, innovating new techniques, new machines,
and that is the case. That is capitalism. So that's why it's constipated. So we're socialist present is a constipated one, because it does still contain the seeds of this. Sorry, seeds and constipation. I need to use different words.
If you eat enough seeds, you can get rid of your constipation. Go ahead.
But right. So, but that's all to say. We still live in cooperative bourgeois society. There are still these basic conditions of cooperation, of which the exchange of labor is the basis. And so, I don't know if that answers exactly your question, but certainly your point about, could social relations refer to how, people relate at work and talk to each other? Well, sure, but no, most profoundly, it's this broader this kind of world historic.
Bourgeois right, which is, if I understand it, tell me if I'm wrong, bourgeois right is a right of an individual. in a bourgeois society. It's a right to own your own labor power. It's a property right, fundamentally.
Well, sure. I mean, I don't think individual is the operative kernel, actually. I think it becomes like that's how we experience it and talk about it and certainly psychologize it. But I don't think that's actually the core. I think freedom is the core, and the individual and their freedom becomes this sort of, subject of that. Sure, yeah. But I think social freedom based on this interdependence of the exchange of labor is much more profound than, can be reduced to the individual. But sure, yeah, that's
like
yeah.
I'm accidentally taking on the role of Bernstein or something right here.
And I'm accidentally taking on the role of more Marx than I can probably properly wield.
Yeah,
No,
right.
because I'm kind of in the world with my dissertation of these Second International Marxists who, of course, are profoundly influenced by and reading and obsessing over their Marx texts, and they're bringing them into publication, etc. But we're not. What I'm focusing on is the debates, say the revisionist debate and the kind of contemporary moment that's in many ways very different than Marx's own. So yeah, I mean, we can certainly have the conversations about capitalism broadly from the 19th century to today, but there's also some very particular conditions in Bernstein's time that in many ways make the crises of capitalism less abstract than we're talking, and very, very political and real and tangible in a profound way.
Yeah, but I worry about
Yeah,
how real and tangible
sure.
they are because,
Yeah,
at a certain point, it becomes so real that it becomes unreal. Like, oh, there's a crisis in capitalism. Yeah, because there's a crisis in capitalism right now in Ukraine, right? This is a crisis of capitalism. And how do we understand that very real, tangible crisis? Well, one way would be to say Putin has nuclear weapons and he's a madman, or, we're not actually getting at how the crisis of capitalism produces this appearance of crisis very well.
Yeah, but part of the reason that it appeared more tangible back then was because there was a mass movement against or to overcome it, namely a socialist movement. And so that is importantly not merely an abstract point. And really the whole motivation for my dissertation is really delving into, okay, what does that mean? What does that look like? What is it to sort of marry dialectics to politics is like, sounds nice. And, this is like revelatory when you're in a platypus reading group. And I sort of wanted to go further into like, okay, well, what did that actually mean for, this high point in the history of the socialist movement, and how were they actually thinking about it, and how is there a kind of a strategic element to dialectics that was very tangible and concrete. So, I mean, one of the ways I talk about in this revisionism chapter is like the mature theory on imperialism, the mature Marxist theory of imperialism, because it's in that era, turn of the 20th century, that you get the political machinations of high imperialist geopolitical armament and kind of imminent war between great powers, but also socioeconomically the kind of phenomena that Kautsky and others are not just describing empirically, but theorizing and applying a kind of immanent dialectical critique to, okay, what does it mean to describe the capitalist totality as entering into definitively an imperialist era? And what are the kind of qualitative aspects of the totality under this new condition? And again, those conditions can't be understood outside of the socialist movement in the way that the organized workers movement is actually putting pressure on the state to make certain decisions, and putting pressure on capitalists and the state to kind of interlock in the way that they're managing capital.
Right. In your piece, you write, the dialectical emphasis on totality troubled Bernstein insofar as it made up a schema built upon abstractions rather than an aggregate of empirical particulars. Secondly, he attacked what he called Marx's collapse theory, sometimes translated as breakdown theory or catastrophic theory, or lumped in with the broader aspects of Marxist crisis theory, although self-collapse theory more aptly conveys the German meaning. According to Kautsky, Bernstein came up with the term himself. So there, he rejects two things: the crisis theory he sees in Marxism, and also the necessity of proletarian revolutionary struggle, and he politically, and he actually says that even if we were to obtain political power through a dictatorship of the proletariat, there we would be left with an insoluble problem.
Mhm.
That I'm really curious about what Bernstein thought couldn't be solved, even by the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Sure. I mean, on some level, I think he's not so concerned with those details because he actually doesn't believe that that's the course of history. He actually, in other words, that's like a rhetorical move he's making about how, this whole, the Zusammenbruch the self-collapse theory,
Mm-hmm.
that whole kind of dialectical conception of capitalism as a kind of contradiction that's manifesting classes leading to some upheaval and a political revolution, that sounds very scary and Jacobin, and that's actually not happening, because if we look at the reality in the 90s, we're seeing the overcoming of these contradictions in various phenomena. He'll point to the seeming democratization of German European societies in certain ways, including just the very conditions of the SPD coming out of 1890, namely the end of the anti-socialist laws from 1890, but also certain social economic developments, including the creation of credit and the ability of citizens to invest in the stock market. So there's various, and really for him also, and this maybe goes back to the Sankara DSA thing, is, he sees and is part of the budding cooperative movement and just the general budding civil social organization of the workers' movement. So like he's seeing that and saying like, oh, this is the seed of socialism, and not only the seed, but like it is, boring into and sort of like step by step evolving, the key word here, right? The contrast to the revolutionary is the evolutionary conception that Bernstein has of socialist transition. And so it's evolving into gradually, in a zero-sum manner, it's displacing capitalism.
Yeah,
so that's the anti-dialectical. Yeah.
Right. So his solution is to reject dialectics and to reject Marx's account of how capitalism goes into crisis and what the role of the proletariat would be to overcome capitalism. He rejects all of that. But the way he does it, according to you, is by saying that even if we were to realize the aims of the Marxist project as we understand it now, we would still face an impossible, insoluble task, and would inevitably suffer a colossal defeat. And I want to know
what that is,
why, what Bernstein thought would lead to that insoluble problem, and why he said it would be that the Marxist approach would face a colossal defeat.
Right. Well,
because and just to one more thing, he's working within the dialectical framework. He's not positing. Because this other move, he is taking up Marx's own account of political struggle, and Marx's own account of how capitalism functions, and pointing to a problem within that account that he says, based on the terms of that accounting, you face an insoluble difficulty. and inevitable defeat. Then his solution is to say, but we don't have to face that defeat because we don't have to accept these terms. We don't have to accept dialectics. We can.
But he's
right?
not just. It's not just like, oh, I have better terms and ideas. It's because of the phenomenon in the 1890s that he's seeing.
Fine.
Right.
But nonetheless,
Yeah.
when he's working abstractly, talking about Marx's own account, he apparently described an insoluble problem in Marx's account, the dialectical account. I want to know what he thought was insoluble.
What he thought was insoluble was the success of the political revolution. In other words,
what about he describes that as a problem that would arise after the success of the political revolution, not before. It would be after you took power, you would still be faced with an insoluble problem. That's what you said.
But I think that's what he's getting at, because the Marxist conception is the proletarian seizure of the state, the so-called dictatorship of the proletariat in the preponderant core capitalist countries is still the beginning, the mere beginning of the social revolution out of capitalism and out of bourgeois right. But that process itself and is like, it's not like it just begins one day and politics is over. There's still the mediation of politics and of capital. And so, in other words, it's a very tricky political gamble. And as much as
but it's no longer a political gamble.
No, but
at this point, hold on. No, it's not, because now you have seized power and have a dictatorship of the proletariat, and you still have a problem. You might say it's political, but it's not. It's not merely political. Political problem once you've gained political power as a dictatorship of the proletariat. You now have an insoluble problem, according to Bernstein.
What is this quotation? I feel like you're really.
The basis of our program is that we seize political power and use it to expropriate the capitalists, wrote Parvis. Bernstein has categorically rejected, based on his judgment that even if they were to seize power, they would face an impossible and insoluble task and would inevitably suffer a colossal defeat.
Yeah, so that's about Bernstein's rejection of the dictatorship of the proletariat. He doesn't think that the political revolution is going to would succeed. Again, he doesn't think. But
just to clarify again, let's see. Even if they were to seize power, they would face an impossible, insoluble task. I'm quoting you.
Yeah, well, and I'm using quotations of, this is Parvis, who kind of begins the revisionism.
So the reason I'm really sticking to that is most of the time when we think about a political defeat, we think about a defeat as we attempt to gain power. This is a defeat we would be facing after we've gained power.
Yeah. No, I mean, and I don't go into it, neither does Parvis and Bernstein, because basically Parvis's point was Bernstein doesn't think that it's possible that you can go from in a seemingly contradictory condition of political, authoritarian, control of the capitalist state by one class, namely the working class, the proletariat, that somehow can be a condition for the social freedom that the socialist revolution will beget. Because it is, I mean, isn't that a contradiction, right? The idea that you actually need to kind of perfect the capitalist state and to, simply overtake it by the currently oppressed class of the proletariat, and that somehow that perfection of the capitalist state will lead to the overcoming of class. Like that's a profoundly dialectical and a profoundly, risky and uncertain gamble conceit, is it not? I mean, I think that's his point. That's a tricky wager, and wouldn't it be much easier and simpler if we could just avoid all of that whole political revolution, that whole state-based transition to overcome the state? That all sounds very self-contradictory. That all sounds very Hegelian. Why don't we look at how capitalism is actually moving us away from it?
The way I look at it is, if we think that the problem is the relationships of of the people to their mode of production. In other words,
Mhm.
the social labor and the material forces, right? If we look at it as a contradiction there, and we say, well, we give the social labor enough power to transform the mode of production, the material forces, not just on the level of making new machines, but changing the foundation of our relationship to those machines, the basis of the
Yeah.
work itself. that would be
Mhm.
an ideological change. It would be a practical change. It would be a technical change. It would
It'd
be
be
a
a profound social
political
change.
change, right? So, and Bernstein says, once we get to that point, there's something insoluble about making that move, and that move is not merely the move of taking political power; it's wielding it to transform the mode of
Mhm.
production, right?
Right, but the point being, what's insoluble is having the socialist revolution from the political revolution. Because in other words, he thinks you don't
Okay, all right,
need a
but I
political
mean,
revolution.
sure, but
He's
the
saying,
socialist
yeah,
revolution then is not the gaining of power in the state. The socialist
exactly,
revolution is not the politics of the party before gaining
exactly.
power, but it is that politics which we now are describing as the politics or the action that would transform the mode of production and the way of life that's founded upon it.
Well, and that's, of course, that's the more meaningful conception of
So,
socialist revolution,
right. So
right?
I'm wondering what is
Yeah.
it that makes Bernstein think that move is impossible and that there's a problem
Mhm.
inherent to that move that
Right,
is insoluble.
right. Well, I can speculate on a few things based on what he says elsewhere.
Mhm.
Um, that might not hinge exactly on this chosen word of insoluble or impossible, but also I think his deeper commitment to a kind of, this does go back to the anti-dialectics. It goes back to his commitment to principles and ethics and ideas. In other words, the whole Hegelian dialectical notion is that the totality
Mhm.
itself can qualitatively change, such that what was appropriate tactically, socially, at one point in time becomes no longer appropriate to the task. So that's the Marxist dialectical conception.
Mhm.
Bernstein's rejection is in large part of that, such that he wants to say such principles as democracy. Um, you know, he was also influenced by the Fabians when he was spending time in England. And so that's where a lot of his kind of progressivism develops. And so he also, in a very thin way, sort of pulls from neo-Kantianism to make a case for, a certain ethical principles and ethical socialism. But that's all to say, to get back to this broader point of there are positive principles and ideas and values that we can name, we can specify, and that those are to continue into the future. So that's the kind of conception that he has that is clearly at odds with the dialectical conception of we are, as a movement, embodying contradictory elements that will themselves actually be overcome and enter into a completely new social totality. Um,
Well, I want to tell you why that
yeah.
hit me the way it did.
Okay.
From my own history is trying to struggle with Marxism. When I
Yeah.
was part of the Marxist Humanist Initiative, and I was talking to Andrew Kleinman a lot. I'd read his book, The Failure of Capitalist Production, I think it was called, and defending, well, I think it was Reclaiming Marxist Capital. And anyway, when I was working with him, I remember a conversation I had with him on the phone that went on for hours, and
Yeah.
where he was saying that there was a difficulty in the question of political revolution to overcome the capitalist mode of production.
Yeah.
And he said, roughly, I'm paraphrasing, that it troubled him, and that no one else seemed to be recognizing this trouble. And the trouble was, if you seize hold of all the factories and all the states that manage those relations between the factories, you and then attempt to change the basis for the work in the factories, you setting up new terms for exchanges, setting up a new basis for the relations between countries, between sectors of the economy, between workers, other than the exchange of equivalents based on labor time in the market, some other basis. You will encounter a moment where you don't have a basis for the relationship. And what you'll have instead, he seemed to imply, is a chaos and a failure and a floundering and waste and maybe inactivity. And it could be that the seizure of all these forces by the working class will turn into a moment of mass chaotic unemployment.
Sure.
And so that was what he was concerned about, was the moment of transition, the moment where you move from one qualitative basis based on the notion that everybody's time spent working is equal, and that the commodities that they produce embody their labor and can exchange in the market on that basis.
Yeah.
With some other basis, some other reason for product to move and to be shared.
I mean, I still think that account, and probably us in the present, are bound to imagine such kind of technocratic or like from above fixes that, oh, this is how we're going to get the social revolution out of bourgeois right and overcome the need to base our society on the exchange of labor. I think that's how we tend to think of it, but I don't think that's the core conception of what the social revolution out of capitalism is meant. It's meant to be a much more it's meant to be the self-organization of the working class, and in other words, it can't be top down. It requires a certain struggle and heterogeneity of attempts and various factions. It's just never going to be some like, oh, we changed by implementing labor notes. We just
I hear what you're saying, and I understand that it can't be top down, but I feel like saying it can't be top down sometimes sort of shifts over into becoming it can't be conceived.
It can't be conceived.
It can't be conceived of, because rather than it's not just that we can't implement it politically from the top down, right? We can't do it in a hierarchical authoritarian way, but also that simply to conceive of it, simply to have a notion of it, of what would be the new basis, immediately gets transformed into a kind of a notion that we're going to impose it from the top, or that it is technocratic, right? And it, like, my vision was, well, we will be free, and therefore we will exchange things based on mutual desire and some sort of aesthetically driven cooperative production, right? So like we won't, so we'll have shared projects of production where people freely associate and make things out of the desire to.
I'm just thinking of like the eco house where I lived like 1 year in college, or some anarchist community that maybe
look
in the 80s. that's our,
right.
We're bound by our own individual and generational conditions to sort of have certain conceptions over others. And
I think of it more like there was a Soviet artist who thought he could turn factories into musical instruments, right?
So like some of the literature, some of the fiction, I actually think is is really great. Like Bogdanov's Red Star is like a utopian. I don't know if have you read that, the science fiction novel? You know,
No,
Alexander.
I haven't read that. No.
Oh, it's really great. It's it's a Marxian kind of utopian conception novella. It's really cool. And I've read somewhat recently Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward. Are you familiar with
Mhm.
that?
No.
That was the after Uncle Tom's Cabin, like the highest selling book in the U.S. in that like late 19th century, the Gilded Age, like sold millions of copies, and it's a socialist. It's not Marxist, but it's consistent with certain aspects of the Marxist kind of conception of what the social revolution would entail, or at least the results, because the whole conceit is the character wakes up in 2000. It's written in 1887, and so the title is Looking Backwards, 2000 to 1888. And it's in Boston, where I am right now. Like, wakes up and it's the year 2000, and he's like living in this socialist utopia. It's really cool because it actually talks about, it imagines a lot of the resolutions of these things, but it doesn't exactly answer your question of like, well, how do we get there? And I guess, at some level, it does come down to this utopianism that I was getting at with the utopian dialectical conception of the Marxists based on qualitative changes of the totality. Again, we think of revolutionary or Marxist as like, oh, you're more radical, you're more willing to be violent or be like, struggle sessions, whatever. No, the profound, what the Hegelian Marxist concept of revolutionary and of revolution, what it meant, what it entailed, was the idea that the basis for society, for the totality, can change. And what they had to base that on was the bourgeois relation, right? The bourgeois revolution, I should say, out of feudalism. And so it's that kind of profound utopian sense of totalistic change that is at odds with an incremental evolutionary change of Bernstein's, which is to say, his trouble with this account of the dictatorship of the proletariat is not only that it implies like Jacobinism and politics and terror and risk and all that, but also the uncertainty that you're getting at, that we can't even conceive of. We don't know what the new social basis will be. We can't actually know, and that's actually part of the utopianism, right? That we can't know. So it does come back to that concept of what is revolution, what's the utopian core here, that I would argue has been increasingly whittled away in the conceptions and articulations of socialism, much less Marxism, up to the present.
Yeah. As an intellectual or an artist or whatever I am, it is unsatisfying to just say, oh, we can't know.
Yeah, but I'll just say that the part of, I think, what I'm doing in that chapter by describing Bernstein, I guess where you were quoting, the impossibility, insoluble character of this dictatorship of the proletariat, part of what I'm doing is trying to flip the script on how we tend to think of, optimistic and pessimistic. And because for Bernstein and for certainly progressives, Fabians in this era and onward, there's a kind of superficial optimism, right? Because what Bernstein is saying is, look, capitalism is imminently resolving the crises that Marx was observing and describing in the earlier decades of the 19th century. So at the surface, that's like optimistic. But what that masks is a pessimism about the capacity for fundamental transformation, right? The Hegelian, the transformation of the totality of the basis. And so that's where there's a deeper optimism at the core of, again, the most controversial concept in Marxism, namely the necessity for a political solution to a social problem, the necessity of a political revolution, the dictatorship of the proletariat, to precisely overcome the need for politics. That's the most controversial. And it's also, again, I think, actually the kind of centerpiece of the utopianism at the heart, the Hegelian dialectical utopianism at the heart of Marxism.
I want to wrap this up, and if you can stick around for another 45 minutes, maybe that'd be great.
Sure.
For a second half. But I just want to say and point this out to you and to everybody who's listening that around 2011, I wrote a book through a Kickstarter campaign, and I went on I'm not quite sure if I'm remembering correctly, but I went on a tour as well to read the book in various cities, and it may have coincided with my first novel, which was about May 1968. And I called the campaign for that, and for the book tour, the Think the Impossible tour. And I made videos about how we needed to think the impossible. And it was at a time where I was kind of encountering Marxism and learning about and reading Capital and things like that. And I thought I'd encountered something that seemed at first blush insoluble, but which I could also imagine, but not quite reason out, overcoming.
Yeah.
And so,
right.
So, and I've been sort of stuck at thinking the impossible in various ways ever since then. And my latest novel, which is now 7 years old, was an attempt to think through how to overcome the value form. And I decided to do it from the top down, get an AI in there to take over society.
Top down?
Yeah, well, because it was the NSA. Yes, because it was the new digital god, the AI, the singularity. They would come in and...
I don't know. It's pretty degenerate, if you ask me.
No, it was a dystopian novel. It turned out to be a totally dystopian kind of nightmare world that I created. But I was like, I know it looks dystopian, but this is socialism. I swear.
I promise.
And then I had to realize, actually, no, the reason all the characters, especially the main character, was completely opposed to the AI and was struggling against it was a good one. And I had actually written it on the side of humanity instead of the AI. So anyway, it's a good conversation, and I don't want
maybe if I can just put a tiny last is, as much as I've emphasized utopianism and perhaps reinforcing the Marxist idea that, well, we can't and shouldn't posit too much of the future society, it really, there is also a strong sense in certainly my figures, my characters in the pre-World War I German party, that again, socialism, constipated socialism, is already present. In other words, the cooperation that in part is made possible by industrial forces of production, and the kind of freedom that it actually does have to deliver on, and certainly promises, it does form the basis of a future socialist society. And so that, again, implicates the question of, well, then how do you overcome relations of labor? Because aren't those inextricable? Well, they certainly are in the capitalist present. But in other words, the kind of cooperative, abundant conditions made possible by capitalism were understood to be the basis of socialism. So there is an imminent character of the basis of socialism that we don't have to sort of imagine, like, oh, what is this dream world going to be after the dictatorship of the proletariat? Well, no, there was an understanding that in some sense the self-organization of society, of the working class, is the basis of socialism. And that, as articulated by Engels and others, what the overcoming of politics really means is just overcoming the need to administer human beings, right? Replacing the administration of people with the administration of things. In other words, that what we call the state qualitatively won't exist, because it will be simply delineated to the tasks of very basic resource distribution, not even at the level of how human beings are spending most of their time, but rather this kind of background condition for a society. And that's certainly like Edward Bellamy looking backwards. It's like the kind of flourishing of society that basically leaves behind the questions that we're dealing with today. So I don't think we actually have to have some exact vision. It's just understanding that the problems would be overcome such that we would have different and new problems.
Right. All right. Well, listen, I'm going to end it there. and then we can do another parrot room. So people should stick around for the parrot room where I expose how degenerate I am on different levels. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.